Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Silva Lopez, and I have the pleasure of interviewing today Mathias Becerra. Mathias, welcome.
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me.
All right. So my first question, Mathias, as part of this HYPIA Research 2.0 cohort is what is your language background for people who are not familiar with it, and how does it connect with your research interests?
Excellent question. So, for the past, let's say, five couple years, I would say I've been very involved in indigenous languages from Latin America. Not only because my family speaks many of them, but at the same time, I was always interested in like my own heritage and in a way how they connected with other languages that are sort of similar because of how grammatically they are used or in a way they're different compositions of specific words. For instance, Quechua is a very agglutinative language, which means that you need to add one word into another, and that sort of inspired me to learn other languages from Asia, like Japanese, Chinese. But I would say I'm mostly focused on indigenous languages from Latin America, but also Norwegian. I love Norwegian, French, Italian, so it's a mix of different things, I would say. And how that connects with my research,
Mhm.
well, I would say it's like a very personal reason, a very personal situation because of my family, because of sort of trying to understand my roots from Peru. But at the same time, I also see a lot of work that we need to do as, as Peruvians, as in my country, like in Latin America, as Latinos, to do more work on indigenous communities, especially when it comes to access to education, policy, and human rights. So in a way, I work on indigenous languages so that I'm able to provide better access to STEM education, basically, so that we can teach more indigenous students to be able to access higher ed education, higher ed careers in STEM. So I have, beyond research, of course, I had my own NGOs, my own organizations that I worked with in the past that really focus on that, like on bridging that gap. But at the same time, we also do a lot of hands-on work where we meet with communities so that we can really understand their challenges and understand kind of resources we can provide so that we can better support them.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's a little bit of what I've been doing so far.
Great, excellent. Well, I have various ideas. So the first one is concerning Quechua. I had the chance of sharing my office when I was at NYU doing my PhD. I share an office with a Quechua specialist. What you
Ooh.
said about Quechua being agglutinative just made me think about a dictionary that I just consulted out of curiosity when I was in that office. And yes, had very, very long words, which is testament to
Yes.
the fact that it's an agglutinative language. I think the scholar was Odin Fernandez, if I'm not mistaken.
Ooh,
Perhaps you
okay,
have heard
okay.
of him.
Awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know I've heard of him. Yeah, nice.
Right. And then here at CSUF, I have supervised end of the term essays concerning Español quechuizado, kind of translanguaging applying
Whoa.
to Quechua and
Yeah.
Spanish.
Yeah,
Also implying diglossia, etc., extended diglossia.
exactly.
Mhm.
Okay, amazing.
And
In a
then,
way, this interview is like also a
yes,
way to get to know you like more about your work. So
right, yeah,
I
that's the
like to
whole
have more
point.
extra conversation in a way.
Exactly, and you're just proving how learning languages can lead to making a difference, right? Which is the whole spirit of THA.
Excellent.
Um, I also like the fact that you brought the research positionality of your research being part of an autobiography, right? Your research is connected to who you are. It's a way of understanding better who you are, right? And how you can contribute to society. I think there's always a personal element there in someone's research, right? At least whenever it is vocational. You also mentioned providing education access, which I also resonate with, particularly STEM fields, right, where indigenous minorities might be traditionally underrepresented.
Yes.
And the connection with community outreach, right, with NGOs and community initiatives. As you may know, I work with Ladino Judo Spanish. I also
Ooh,
have my own, it's called Community Interest Company in the UK, which is the equivalent of a charity. And we also work closely with the community. So this is a fascinating effort. Yeah. Mhm.
amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Mhm. And how does then this research connect to critical polyglot studies, to the main tenets of this subfield of critical social linguistics?
Yeah, I think we had like a sort of short conversation via email, but
Mhm.
in a way, I wanted to relate it to more accessibility of resources when it comes to learning the linguistic problematics, the linguistic issues
Mhm.
of language learning in general. I think something that is very critical is that most polyglots want to pile up all their languages in a way and just want to show off like how many languages they know to the world.
Right.
And I mean, that's
Mhm.
exciting, of course. That's amazing. But what happens with that knowledge that they know? Like how it can be applicable to other fields to make an impact? Like I love when I started my own research, my own journey learning languages. Always got inspired by different people doing interviews, etc. But I also wanted to know what else they did. Like, are you
Mhm.
just learning languages? Is that just your hobby? But what are you
Mhm.
actually doing with them? So, in a way, that sort of started for me, to better understand how we can make these more applicable. Something that is like
Mhm.
a research that is more applicable for everyone.
Mhm.
I think as part of what I did in the past is that through my own organizations, like my organization, an NGO, it's called Polyglot Science, which basically focuses on providing this accessibility of resources to indigenous Latino students from Latin America to learn
Mhm.
STEM resources, STEM subjects in their own indigenous languages, but at the same time be connected with other mentors, with other like scientists from different fields around the world to learn about those languages. Like we had people from Sweden, we have people from Norway and other countries that they also wanted to teach about what they knew in their own languages. So it's more like a sort of how can I say, like a sort of exchange of ideas, like a sort of
Mhm.
focus group where we had opportunities to practice languages as well, but also learn from each other.
Right. Great. And I'll be very, very happy to link your NGO below the video so people can explore it in their own time. Um, you mentioned also a number of things. If I had to summarize THA, as I said before, the slogan will be learn languages make a difference. And I think what summarizes the polyglot industry matrix, as we call it in the critical polyglot studies, is learning languages missing the point. Well, as you
Mm.
said, it's not about quantitative accumulation in the
Yep.
Marxist sense of the proliferation of commodities that one then hoards, but it's rather about languages, not so much as an end on itself, but as a means to the end of bettering the world or making the world a better place, right? So one angle is exactly that, is to help people who are underrepresented in STEM to facilitate that access through translations in one of their languages or the main language or their L1. In that sense, I was thinking, in the case of Latino or Judeo-Spanish, one of the adaptations that we have to implement are the so-called gerontological adaptations, meaning
Mm.
that
Mm.
most speakers of Latino are elderly people, and so they want bigger fonts or they want to be able to speak rather than to type.
Yep.
I was wondering if something similar happens in the case of Quechua or other indigenous languages that you work with.
Oh my God, you nail it with that question. That's exactly the question I want to ask myself during my honor thesis here at Stanford. So I'm a
Mhm.
senior, and that's basically what I want to do as part of my, let's say, final capstone project for my like whole undergraduate career, because um, it's a whole process of applying to different grants to be able to travel to Latin America and do that sort of work, but at the same time having the input of communities to really understand what they need. And one of those things is, accessibility basically. Like
Mhm.
everyone, I'm also very passionate about education, linguistics, language revitalization, but as part of my work, I also do a lot of AI, like AI
Mhm.
learning, AI training, machine learning, human computer interaction, and basically how that relates to accessibility is how we can create better user interfaces for elderly people, for children to be able to see themselves represented, see their languages represented in different technological devices. As you
Mhm.
mentioned, some elderly people struggle to use a cell phone because, of course, there's a lot of course, this is a history, like sort of, how can I say, like historic context that there was there's a lot of lack of resources when it comes to education to be able to read their own language in something that is physical, like a cell phone. So how we can improve that, how can we bridge that gap? But at the same time, if that gap is already bridged, how we can make more these more accessible. Like, should we increase the number of the sizes of the
Mhm.
different fonts of all the content that we write in different apps? But how would that be applied to Quechua, which is agglutinative, that you need to
Mm.
add one word to another, and that creates such a long word, and in a way that's not like sort of like when it comes to speaking about my own side of HCI or user testing, user interfaces, like we are breaking so many rules when it comes to A/B testing and using these sort of devices for language learning, because the main thing that's happening here is like language Quechua and other indigenous languages are so specific that if you change a specific word or suffix, like the whole word wouldn't make sense at all. Or
Right.
at the same time, some words are very long and are not that easily translatable into English.
Right.
It's like from English for whatever to, indigenous languages, that sometimes is it better that we just adapt those English words, like we use them just directly into Quechua? Or is it better that we look for a more community-centered translation, neologism, if we can call it like
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
so that it better represents what like the community is trying to say, so that it's more like something that came out after the community. But that
Mhm.
also raises more questions like, will people be able to be comfortable using those kind of words? Is this something that all dialects of Quechua will approve? That there are more and more issues because Quechua is a family of languages, so
Right.
we have like some differences between each other, like from the northern part of Peru, the Amazonian part of Peru, the central part of Peru, which is the one that is more like sort of broad, but at the same
Mhm.
time is like, wow, you nail it with that question. That is something that I want to find out, like in my last year of education that I have here.
Yes, I was going to ask you about precisely that, whether Quechua was a hyperonym rather than a glottonym, right? Whether it was a name for a number of varieties of languages that are somehow mutually intelligible,
Hmm.
but rather than the name of a specific language. Because I was thinking about the example of Nahuatl. And
Yeah.
whenever my students do essays about Nahuatl, which is something they often do as they come from Mexican American backgrounds, I always see the same thing. I always see that they start referring to Nahuatl as a family of languages, and then they say, well, the one I'm going to focus is this particular
Yes.
one. Which
Yes.
also brings me to an additional question, which is the role of these indigenous languages that have millions of speakers, but are nevertheless from impoverished communities, right? In
Mhm.
large language models.
Yeah.
How has been your experience with that? For instance, when I launched the first version of a chatbot in Ladino,
Hmm.
I was working with a computational linguist with Alp Octem, shout outs to him. And we tried different large language models and stress tested them in Ladino to see if it was even worth it to connect the previous machine translation system
Yeah.
via APA to a large language model and adopt an interface like Telegram or something like that.
Yeah.
The machine translation system was performing beautifully, but when we tried connecting it, the results were not good. However,
Yeah.
when we tried just interacting with the LLM directly,
Mhm.
surprisingly, Claude performs so much better than ChatGPT or DeepSeek, etc. What has been your experience?
That's such a good question. I think like we can divide these two in two different sections. One is like what is remaining, what is our main problem when it comes to interacting with LLM models, especially when it comes to AI conversations.
Mhm.
The main issue is that AI models are very like have a lot of difficulty when it comes to understanding um, indigenous languages, agglutinative languages, but at the same time, we don't have those resources yet. We don't have pre-recordings of data of recording or like a speakers, native speakers speaking in the language so that the LLM could be trained on that. Because we are not only tackling one dialect of Quechua, we also want to know other different varieties, specific like forms of sentences or even expressions that are kind of hard to explain when it comes to LLM models because they are just so let's say fixated on one thing or the languages that they were trained on. So but that's something that I'm also exploring as part of my work because I know some people in Peru that are already doing like sort of ASLR translation, like voice training, And there's a lot of hope when it comes to getting those recordings preset. But that also, of course, involves people, it involves speakers themselves, because we want to get their approval when it comes to recording their voices so that these LLM models could be able to learn from them. That's one part of like the whole issue. But now, like, let's say what is working so far is like
Mhm.
translation. Translation when it comes to reading translation. I've seen specifically when it comes to Southern Quechua, like sort of what Google Translate currently does, because Google Translate
Right.
has Quechua.
Has
Um,
Quechua. Mhm.
yes, so that works for what I've tried so far and the different APIs that I've trained it on. It works fine, I would say, when it comes to creating like a sort of basic medium of information, like an app. If you want to create an app to teach basic concept of mathematics, of science, that's
Mhm.
fine. But when it comes to a specific, let's say, technical terminology, that's when it gets sort of complicated because are we really trying? That also comes to like community center values. Like, are we trying to translate those specific terminologies, or do we want to guide ourselves from other languages and see what
Right.
they have done? Like, sort of
Right.
guide ourselves. Like, are they translating the word into their own language?
Right.
What has been done for other indigenous languages in Latin America? I remember that I worked for an NGO before coming to Stanford, where we had this huge spreadsheet where we had focus groups with other different native speakers of different dialects of Quechua, not only in Peru, but also Ecuador, Colombia, Argentina. And we gather like once a week so that we can be able to discuss about all of this, what works best for our community. And in a
Mhm.
way, we wanted to agree upon like, okay, so this is the word we selected for science, which was yachai,
Mhm.
but let's agree upon on using it in our communities and see
Right.
how native speakers react to the word. Is this
Right.
something that perhaps they will be able to adapt into their regular
Right.
vocabulary, or is this something that they immediately reject or don't understand? So
Right.
it's a lot of going back and forth and testing.
Right. Mhm. Great. So, in that sense, brings me to my next question. I was thinking about the issue of authenticity. I recently published a journal article with Alejandro Acero concerning authenticity in my Ladino chatbot and what users judged as being authentic Ladino or not. Spoke about native speakers, which, as you know, is a notion I have critiqued quite a lot. And in critical social linguistics, it's a problematic notion, right? So we tend to speak about L1 speakers from a chronological perspective, as in the first language you learned.
Yep.
But then again, the fact that it is your first language doesn't translate automatically into being your dominant language. Or it might
Yeah.
be throughout a certain period of your life and then fall out of use or being brought back in, right? So that's why we have semi-speakers, for instance, right? People whose first language is that language, but then did not practice it afterwards, after, say, leaving their homes, etc. So
Yeah.
what is perceived as authentic in the community of Quechua speakers, and how do you gauge whether the community wants to accept a term, in this case for science or for fields where a term doesn't exist yet? There are platforms, for instance, in Ladino, it's called Ladino Comunidad, it's an email list of people who exclusively speak Ladino, etc. So that's how I gauge the reception that a certain neologism has. How do you do that
Yeah.
in Quechua and what counts as an authentic or authenticated Quechua speaker?
Good question. So since we're a family of languages, and we try to look for different synonyms between dialects. For instance, if we don't have one specific word in Southern Quechua from Peru, we want to guide ourselves from our brothers from Ecuador because they have Quechua there, and they have a lot of words that they already use as part of their language. What is most amazing about Ecuador is that they're even far advanced, like from Peru, when it comes to educational initiatives. And they
Mm,
use Quechua. They have their own institutes. They have adapted a lot of terminology when it comes to,
mm,
scientific resources, scientific articles, even. So we always like to look on what do we already have. But that also aligns to a lot of work collection. I don't know, like how can I call it? Like a lot of field work.
mm,
I remember that. when I traveled back to the summer, like my last summer, as part of a fellowship that I won here at Stanford, that allowed me to go back to Peru and conduct a lot of field work with native speakers. So I work with different organizations like Quechua para Todos, which is an organization that basically focuses on education, teaching, but at the same time, the part of the more linguistical side of things is like looking at all different books available that we have on Quechua and creating a spreadsheet of what suffixes we have available. So we want to compare from all different authors that have already written about suffixes, neologisms, expression, and try to compare them between each other
Mhm.
and collect as many things as we can. And from there, as part of my work done there, we collected amount like around 200 suffixes. And this is not public at all, of course, but this is something that perhaps we want to explore as in the future,
Mhm.
for future like other languages as well, to serve as a sort of open source inspiration or open source database so that they can guide themselves to be able to understand what can be done, like what can be served as a sort of foundation so that we can use that as a way to guide ourselves when it comes to our doing our own research when it comes to creating neologisms. But in going back to your question is like first understanding what we have available, books, interviews with the speakers, traveling and going to different countries, speaking with our brothers from different dialects. And before that process goes into place, we want to have like a sort of judicial, like sort of group focus group where we can approve these terminologies and see if we can use it in our community. And if we don't have a word for what we want to translate, that's where like the sort of neologism process starts to, function. We always like to guide ourselves from suffixes that
Mhm.
mean one specific thing that can be added to a word so that they can, in a way, make sense for the word that we want to translate. One example is the word of science. We don't have a
Mhm.
word from science. We
Mhm.
always use a word ciencia for in
Right.
Quechua.
Mhm.
But we already had, like, let's say the word yachai, which means to know,
Mhm.
yeah, to know, knowledge, study even. But we added the suffix chai, which means to do, to create, to conduct. And that sort of, when you mix it forms yachaicha, which is to conduct studies, to
Right.
conduct information, to conduct studies. So basically, that sort of made sense for us as a community,
Mhm.
and we started to use it like in
Mhm.
real, sort of mediums in real conversation. And if people
Mhm.
approve it, that's where we start to publish something physical, like a sort of
Mhm.
vocabulary or glossary that people can
Mhm.
can guide themselves from for article writings.
Mhm. Great. And this is just my last question. And it touches up on what you just said now. This week I went to a conference called a Language Endangerment Conference at Cambridge. It's an annual one. And somebody was working with Hawaiian, and he mentioned the concept language distance. And that distance is between academics and the community. And he said that the
Yeah.
Hawaiian spoken by the community is very distant from the Hawaiian speaking by academics, but then
Mhm.
nonetheless, when it comes to social policy, academics are heard and held as authenticated, as I said before, speakers, as legitimate speakers, in a way that community participants are not. Is there such language difference in Quechua between the community and academics, and how is that handled?
Whoa, I love that question. I feel that from my experience when it comes to getting to know researchers, like Quechua researchers that have done
Mhm.
or published articles fully in Quechua, uh, they had sort of advisors that have experience in both of those settings, like in natural conversations, but also that have trained themselves or have done like the whole career learning linguistics, specialized in indigenous resources, indigenous languages in Latin America. So I feel that it is true that if we were to approach a community with an article that we have published and we start to read them like out loud, that may sort of create like a sort of impact in a way that is like, oh wow, you're speaking in very formal terms on this
Mhm.
is sort of like, well, what are you even talking about? You're being extremely formal.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's like we understand it. We understand it. Like we understand what you're trying to say. Yes, some words are kind of hard to, to paraphrase, to identify
Mhm.
because some students, some, let's say, teachers, doers, etc., they are the ones who adapt certain words from their specific
Mhm.
dialects and they receive advice, approval from their different organizations. This is also another thing, but there's a lot of debate when it comes to the different vowels and how Quechua is written. There's like a debate between five vowels, three vowels, but that
Right.
yeah, that's an issue of another thing. But in a way, when it comes to speaking it, if you read it out loud, I feel that communities are able to understand that. Are able to understand, but of course, you need to specify specific terms if you're if you're being very technical, especially when it comes to medicine or law.
Right.
But yeah, I would say that there's this balance between both of those sides, I would say.
Great. So it's great to know that the distance is not incommensurable, right? That the distance is not
Yeah.
yet as important as in the case of Hawaiian, for instance. Well, Matthias, thank you so much for joining me today. Congratulations on joining HYPIA Research 2.0, and I very much look forward to continuing working with you on these topics.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me
Thank you,
today.
Matthias.
Bye bye.
All right.